Hi all, Stingy Hat here, and I'm having more fun than a human being should be allowed to have, and that's because Verily is released, and I'm doing a postmortem now, talking about what went right and what didn't go right, which is probably a lot of things. So it's been a year. The game's out now. I started in Christmas break of last year. It's supposed to be a week-long project with my daughter, and it turned into a whole year, and there's some lessons learned there. So let's start out with what went right. So I think the core gameplay loop is fun. In this case, it's about going through a dungeon, acquiring loot and money, buying upgrades, and then going back into the dungeon and getting a little further, and rinse and repeat. The combat system is pretty simple, but it is at least involved. You have to actually actively block and aim your spells. I'm happy with how all that turned out. I was able to recreate several old DOS role-playing game staples like line of sight, secret rooms, pressure plates, teleporters, stuff you'd be familiar with if you played any games from the 90s or late 80s, either Beholder or Ultima 1, that sort of thing. I'm happy with how all that turned out. So this isn't the first game I've ever released. My last two games were released about 10 years ago for Android and Windows Phone. One of the big takeaways from those games I had were those were a little bit more abstract games, and there were new tutorial levels. There were help menus, but as it turns out, nobody looks at those. So, in Verily, I made sure to have a tutorial level, and I'm happy with how all that turned out. There's both the tutorial level that once you get through it, you know how to attack and shoot spells, which is pretty much 90% of what you need for the entire game. And on top of that, there's also in-game help menus that you can access. So I think all that went pretty well from what I've talked to the people who played it. I don't think anybody was too confused as to how the game works. About 3/4 of the way through the game development, I brought my wife on board to help do some level editing, and that turned out to be a really good idea. I always had this idea of only working on games myself, being a one-stop, one-person shop. That turns out to be not a great idea, and bringing in my wife was a big help. It's just a nice force multiplier, and also just something I don't have to think about. It clears up some mental bandwidth. There's so much involved with game development, so to be able to offload just a couple levels onto my wife really helped things out. And it also helped that I had a decent tool set so that I could get her onboarded and being productive really quickly without a bunch of hand-holding. So that turned out really great. One cool thing about working on a game for over a year is I can see how my skills develop just looking at the game assets. So specifically the artwork. I did all the character art myself, and it starts with the player sprite, the druid, all the way to the boss of the game, the lich, and everything in between. And you can see my skills. Not that I'm great, I'm not an artist at the end of the day, but you can see the sprite work get more sophisticated as the game goes on, and that's kind of cool to see. You're putting in work, and you can feel it paying off. And finally, the game did release at the end of the day. Releasing games is really hard, and it's a skill in and of itself, and I'm glad I was able to finally push it out. So what could have gone better? On the technical side of Unity, I used a couple things that I probably wouldn't do going forward. One is don't destroy on load. I have singleton game objects for the game manager and input manager. And rather than using don't destroy on load, which ends up being a little bit on the clunky side because sometimes you do want to destroy those objects and it doesn't make it easy, I'd probably use additive scenes. I also made every level in the game its own scene, which is kind of nice organizationally and conceptually. But I think going over and doing it again, I would probably just have one single game scene and load in those assets into that scene. I think that would work better from a code perspective. I should have brought in more help on the game sooner. Bringing my wife on board was a big help, and I could have brought more people on board and got even more help and made it a bigger, better game. It didn't come into focus Verily as a fully playable game until like really the last 2 or 3 weeks leading up to release, and that's obviously not a good thing either. I kept pushing things off because I felt like I had to have XYZ features before I was ready to really show it or play it or whatever have you. And if I was doing it over again, I would probably have something playable really soon that I could iterate on rather than keep pushing it off, because those last 2 or 3 weeks up to release were really grueling, and my willpower's already very well sapped after a year of working on the thing, so it wasn't pleasant. As far as expectations go, I never did have a lot of expectations for Verily. Just doing this all for a hobby, and it's free. I would like to get my games in front of more people, and I'm not entirely sure how to do that other than just make better games. So I'm just going to keep plugging away and see how that works. As for what comes next, I've already started work on a new game. I want to have something playable in an alpha state. It'll also be free within probably the end of January. So we'll see how that goes. I also want to start up my YouTube stuff a little more and have actual like edited content, like videos like this and tutorials and devlogs, at least once a week. I'll continue streaming games like Baldur's Gate, but I want actual edited content as well. So my daughter's playing me off, so I should wrap up. Thanks for listening. Leave a like if you feel so inclined. If you don't, that's cool too. And I'll catch you later. Bye.